Agencies use government-wide acquisition contracts, or GWACs, to purchase technology together and lower the cost of IT solutions. The proposal submission period for one of those GWACs, the Chief Information Officer Solutions and Partners 4 contract, or CIO-SP4, ended last week. But the NIH's acquisition vehicle continues to face delays. Alan Thomas is Chief Operating Officer at IntelliBridge. He's former Commissioner of the Federal Acquisition Service at GSA. Alan, welcome to the program.
Hi, Mimi. Good to be with you today.
Give us an overview of the CIO-SP4 government-wide acquisition contract. What's the purpose? What are the issues here?
Sure. So, as you said, it's a GWAC, a government-wide acquisition contract. It's one of 10 or so GWACs that was created in 1996 out of the Clean-Cohen Act. It's a big deal, right, for both industry and government. Billions of dollars of IT spending flow through these GWACs. CIO-SP3 is CIO-SP4. Will be, when it's in place, certainly one of the top GWACs that agencies agencies use. As you said, it was submitted. Proposals were submitted last week on September 26th. I'd say it was a bit of a rocky road to get there, right? There were a number of amendments, including some last-minute amendments that made it challenging from an industry perspective, and I think kind of increased the burden on industry to respond.
Why were there so many amendments? What happened?
Well, I think it's a good question, right? Because the folks at NIH followed the right playbook ahead of time, right? They did all the kind of communication you'd want to do with industry ahead of time. There were draft RFPs, there were industry days, there was a lot of dialogue and back and forth. I think industry's voice was definitely heard. What I think was perplexing from an industry standpoint was, with all of that feedback, right? Then there were a number of changes that were made through amendments to the RFP after it was released, right? And again, that adds significant kind of burden and uncertainty from an industry perspective, makes it more difficult to respond. It perturbed a number of teaming relationships. I mean, the government in this case made some significant changes that really impacted how people team and how they'll be scored and evaluated on the proposal. So that was a challenge, and I think, from my perspective, I don't know that I've ever seen an industry association like the Professional Services Council, which represents many of the largest IT and professional services vendors doing business with the government, come out and essentially say, hey, we should take a pause here for 30 or 45 days to let industry digest all these changes, right? That's how significant the changes were.
Well, let's take a step back, Alan, and talk about GWACs in general. Do you think these are working? Do we have too many, too few?
So, look, I think GWACs are working, right? They serve the intended purpose, right? They save government buyers time, and they reduce risk, right? So from that perspective, I think they're working. It's an interesting question around, are there too many or too few, right? They're only around 10 or so. So on the face, you would say, well, that doesn't seem like too many. But as I said in the opening, these were created 25 years ago in legislation. I don't think the government's actually ever stepped back and done really a comprehensive overlap and gap analysis for the GWACs that exist out there to see, do they really need 10? Do they need more? Do they need fewer? My sense is there's pretty significant overlap. The CIO-SP vehicles are really focused on health IT, but when you look at the spending that flows through there, it's used for a much broader mission set than just health IT. I mean, DoD and DHS are some of the largest users of the vehicle, and they're using it for mission sets well beyond health IT. So given the burden that it puts on industry to respond to these GWACs, right? I mean, teaming and prep is literally years in the making for these vehicles because there's billions of dollars in spending on the line. I do think it would make sense to kind of take a step back and have somebody, say like an OMB in the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, maybe do a little bit of an analysis to see, again, where there are overlaps and where there are gaps and if some fine tuning can be done.
Do you think that they're just locking in the already existing set of vendors that we've already got out there? Is this a way of locking people out that could have innovative, new high-tech solutions?
Fair question and an insightful one, Mimi. Possibly, right? And I think you've certainly heard that argument. Look, I think in the latest iteration of some of these GWACs, you've seen the government try and take some steps to prevent that from being the case. It'll be interesting to see if they're effective in doing that. So, for example, in the Alliant 2 GWAC that GSA has in place, right? They put some on-ramps in, which means at certain points in the procurement you can add new vendors to the mix, right? So if you get, I mean, look, there's a lot of innovation in the technology space, right? So if you put a contract in place for 5 or 10 years, you get 3 or 4 years into it, you know, there are going to be new companies with new ideas that came along. You may want to add them to the mix. So an on-ramp can help do that. You can also create a scope that's flexible. And I think, you know, both Alliant 2 did that, and I think the folks at NITAC tried to do that on CIO-SP4, which allows vendors, existing vendors, to add new capabilities and bring new capabilities to market. So you think about things like robotic process automation or artificial intelligence or machine learning. You know, if you were putting something in place 5, 6, 7 years ago, you might not have had those as part of your scope, right? So scope flexibility allows existing vendors to bring those new capabilities to market. As I said, from my perspective, I think the jury's still out. Let's see what Alliant 2 looks like in a few years. Let's see what CIO-SP4 looks like once it gets awarded and put into practice. Are new companies being on-ramped? Are new capabilities being brought to market? Something to watch.
And especially in the health IT sector in the middle of a pandemic, we definitely hope for the most innovative, quickest solutions as possible. Alan, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me, Mimi.